Record.
Life and love, although they offer us concessions, change will not come from above. Some commanders, sisters, for the struggle carries on. The Internationale unites the world in song.
I believe you are on and ready to go. We're starting.
It's just my cue. We had to do a lot of last-minute rearrangements thanks to COVID exposures and work demands. So I'll read this intro that was written by my political education comrade, Ashley Gibson. I'd have been there, except for one of those possible COVID exposures the other day myself. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session of Socialists of America's Spring, our spring semester of New York City's citywide night school. We're excited to get into our topic for tonight, the Great Upheaval and the Red Scare. First, I'll share a bit about why we do this work and why political education is important for socialists today. As most of you probably know, the intention of this series is to cultivate a deeper knowledge of American socialist history and to shatter any idea that socialism is merely a foreign import to the US experience, or that the rising movement of today is completely new. We want to resurrect stories and histories of the socialists who have come before us in their varied efforts to create a more equitable world. And I think most, if not all of us here, share an understanding that this rich history matters, even if our current reality doesn't match our ideals. The choice many of us make when we participate in events and movements like this one is to continue to educate ourselves in active resistance and a foundation for organizing moving forward. We can draw inspiration and important lessons from this knowledge as we move forward in our own push for a better world. Without an understanding of how power works, we can't effectively strategize or challenge it. Our hope is that night school becomes a tool to sharpen our own skills of analysis and arguing and reasoning against anti-socialist propaganda. An understanding of our history and of the socialist experiments that have come before us is a critical part of that education. Night school is meant to add depth to the organizing work that happens throughout the chapter, making theory and further education around key issues of our time more digestible and accessible. Each of us needs to be able to understand, communicate our why socialism, why not capitalism, and why now. As the Democratic Party plays the role of the good guy and our country sells us the idea that this is as free and as good as it gets, people are alienated from one another in their suffering and convinced that politics just can't work for them. It's all the same, and no one has ideas or answers for how unbearably hard life can be. We're also used to feeling that we aren't heard or seen by our political leaders, and we hope that night school can become a place where we can connect with one another and support one another as we develop our own voices in discussing politics and our visions for the future. With that, we move on to our guest speakers who will walk us through a discussion on the Great Upheaval and the Red Scare. Our presenters tonight are Peter Menniti and Jamie Peck. Peter is a software developer and part of DSA's Lower Manhattan branch. His pronouns are he, him. Jamie, a North Brooklyn member, is a writer and co-host of the podcast Everybody Loves Communism. I can affirm that. Despite the gender ambiguous name, Jamie's a she, her. Okay, let me pass this along to whoever's next in the sequence.
Great. Ready? Can everybody hear me? Yes. Put it on. Okay. Okay, I am Peter, and tonight we are going to talk about the period of labor organizing that happened roughly between like late 1870s through to 1920.
Can you speak up? Can you speak up?
Yeah,
People
sorry. We're going to talk about the period of labor organizing that happened in America between the late 1870s and the 1920s, which began with the Great Upheaval and ended with the Red Scare. Although we are actually going to go back a little bit before the start of the Great Upheaval first, to the very beginnings of American industrialism. Next slide. Which happened in New England. This is a textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, water powered, opened in the early 1800s. Next slide. This was the site of one of the first ever strikes in America.
A little louder, sorry.
I'll try my best.
Okay.
This industrial mill was founded in 1836. It was, like many places at this time, a full-on company town. So the workers' residences, the shops were all owned by the textile company. It was staffed by 8,000 women, mostly young ones, some as young as 10. Despite the fact that the owners showed this off as being superior to the dark and satanic English factory system, it was not actually that great. You were locked into a 12-month contract, 15-hour shifts, and 73 hours a week. This was all very much the norm at this time. There was no labor law, basically. And there were also overseers on factory floor in the workers' residences. This was a huge shift from the mostly small business and agricultural economy that existed pre-industrialism. People were not really used to this level of control over their work. You know, you're a skilled artisan or a farmer, and you basically work under your own management. That's like very tight system of control managed by managers and machines was brand. The overseers also enforced Protestant morality, which just like insult to injury, if you ask me. Next slide. Yeah, when industry took off, it was a huge increase in productivity. These companies are seeing 14% growth every year. This was also fairly normal. Industrial style labor systems are much more efficient than small artisanal systems for the most part. And this is, as Marx said, part of what allowed them to take over the world so rapidly. However, working 15-hour shifts under tight management is no one's idea of a good time. So the workers responded to this by organizing a turnout, which is the early 1800s word for a strike. This did not work out for them. They not only were they forced to return to work with no concessions, but many of them were run out of town. And this is another thing that is important to know about this period, that the legal framework for union activity that we know and maybe don't love, but know today, only came into being really in the 1930s. So union organizing at this time was happening in sort of a legal gray area. The workers did have the right to freely associate, of course, but they also had zero protection against retaliation from employers. And as you can see with this example, the employers pulled no punches against striking. And They also used vicious anti-union propaganda. You can see here a spirit of evil has overcome the workers. This did not dampen anyone's spirit. There was another strike, which was more successful, lasted several weeks. But the company was eventually able to break it by jacking up the rent on the company-owned lodging that the workers had, violating their own labor contract. Next slide. So here we have a long quote by one of the striking workers who wrote a memoir about their experience as one of the workers. Said, "My own recollection of this first strike turnout, as it was called, is very vivid. I worked in a lower room where I had heard the proposed strike fully, if not vehemently discussed. I had been an ardent listener to what was said against this attempt at oppression on the part of the corporation, and naturally I took sides with the strikers. When the day came on, which the girls were to turn out, those in the upper room started first, and so many of them left that our mill was at once shut down. Then, when the girls in my room stood irresolute, uncertain what to do, asking each other, would you or shall we turn out? And not one of them having the courage to lead off, I began to think that they would not go out after all their talk became impatient and started on ahead saying, it's childish bravado. I don't care what you do, I'm going to turn out, whether anyone else does or not. And I marched out and was followed by the others." Next slide. As I looked back at the long line that followed me, I was more proud than I had ever been since at any success I may have achieved, and more proud than I shall ever be again until my own beloved state gives to its women citizens the right of suffrage. The agent of the corporation where I then worked took some small revenges on the supposed premiums. On the principle of sending the weaker to the wall, my mother was turned away from the house, that functionary saying, "Mrs. Hanson, could not prevent the older girls from turning out, but your daughter is a child, her you could control." It is hardly necessary to say that so far as results were concerned, the strike did no good. Dissatisfaction of the operatives subsided or burned itself out, and though the authorities did not accede to their demands, the majority returned to their work, and the corporation went on cutting down. And after a time, as the wages became more and more reduced, the best portion of the girls left and went to their homes, or to the other employments that were fast opening to women until there were very few of the old guard left. And thus, the status of the factory population of New England gradually became what we know it to be today. Next slide. So this is more about this first strike from a workers' newspaper at the time. And they said about these failed strikes, "We did not say that the turnouts have not been useful, but that they are so no longer. They always result in the triumph of capital and the sadder and more hopeless suppression of labor, and the oppression which comes of hope extinguished. A merely incoherent, tumultuous, and clamorous multitude cannot accomplish anything effectual. In all reform, there must be a common end or purpose in view, a well-defined method of order, and devoted, generous, persistent action. Mere turnouts do not include. Instead of quibbling, temporizing, and compromising with capitalists, want to see working classes getting daily into a position of independence through a system of cooperation and mutual care. When they can obtain the means of living independent of the capitalists, then, and not until then, strikes and turnouts. We must consolidate and combine so as to become their own employers, do their own trading, without the reference of go-betweens and jobs. Let them unite in themselves both the functions of labor and capitalists. So long as we are dependent upon the cotton mills for employment, so long shall we be oppressed. They who work in the mills ought to. So bear in mind, this is before Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. So yeah, this consciousness that probably reminds you quite a bit of later socialist thought and practice is right here in this workers' article, engendered by the conditions of factory life, not by intellectuals telling them. So, yeah, we do have a question at the bottom of this slide, which I feel like I answered a little bit myself. So sorry for that, but, does anyone else have any comments about the very socialist consciousness that these people developed before even Karl Marx, like very, very early on, almost as soon as America does?
I can't quite read that at the top, but it looks like it says this article is from 1848. To what extent were there connections with the revolutionary movement around the world with these mill workers in New England? Was it an independent arising of the situation? So is it connected to other movements around the world?
Well, if I could answer
Yeah.
for Peter.
I'm gonna turn this one over to Steve because it's better.
I can't comment on any direct relationships, but I do know that this period of New England is before any mass migration of that whole generation of 48 to the United States. So I can only assume that it's a convergent evolution, perhaps similar conditions breeding similar consciousness. But I can't answer that definitively, unfortunately.
That was my impression as well. I'll end back.
So when this was written, did like unions exist then? Had trade unions developed yet, or this was just like the beginning?
No, they did not. Trade unions, there may have been some, but it was in its very infancy. They never existed. And these workers were not. They existed. Lee.
Yeah, not really a question. I just want to point out that the existence of commodity production developing so quickly here had a lot to do with the availability of cotton at low prices from the slave South. And that was one of the main factors why it developed so quickly. And it's this quick development because most of these people who were just lived at home, they were farmers or whatever, and had never worked. And now suddenly there were lots of jobs to do that.
It might be a bit of a reach, but I feel like I see in the second paragraph the idea that whoever's writing it said they want to see the workers getting into a position of independence, right? They want to see them developing like structures within their own, like maybe like a combined culture or other kinds of things, so they can act their actions, their strikes and turnouts like mean something or have strength. I feel like from that you can. It at least reminds me of later discussions of like political freedom. You know what I'm saying? Like with the SPD and stuff in Germany, and like also socialist parties in Russia. Like the idea that like their big demands were like suffrage. You know what I'm saying? Like with like freedom of press and like freedom to associate and all these things, can they gain the independence that is required to like spread thought and like give like a workers' movement strength? I feel like you can kind of see the beginning of that concept, or at least like an innate understanding. And again, like you mentioned earlier, like without intellectuals telling workers as such, you know what I mean?
Yeah, thoroughly agree. Anyone else for this? Harrington.
Yeah, I like how she points out that it's not enough to have momentary consciousness, that like continuity of consciousness is required for there to be a labor movement. I just, for some reason, was looking up John Locke on Wikipedia yesterday, and when he defines like the self, like what the self is continuity of consciousness. So it makes sense to me that for the labor movement, that also is required for it to have a sense of self, that it would have that continuity.
Yeah, two more on this one and then we should move on. Yeah, I'll you and then I'll turn it back and then we should probably keep moving.
I want to say that the use of the word capitalist is also probably it has developed at that time very recently, this meaning of a person who holds capital, because I think the word capitalist first developed as a derogatory term to talk about people who hold capital, and the fact that this piece already uses this word to delineate who is the enemy. It's pretty interesting that it's this early in 1848. And also I want to say this idea of cooperativism. So like not like state-sponsored socialism, but like grassroots cooperativism, and democratic control, kind of the feeling of democratic control of the means of production also has that that spirit that has been theoretically developed later in socialist law.
Yeah, we will definitely see that come back later in this period of labor organizing. And one more at the back.
I was just gonna say, in as far as this did arise independently of, say, the socialist movements that were going on in Europe, I think it does point to the material basis of socialism, how it arises from material conditions, and is a pretty strong point in favor of scientific socialism. The fact that you're running this experiment in different places and getting the same results, and you're kind of coming out with the same theories.
Are we getting the same results?
Interesting question, we'll come back to later, but I actually thoroughly agree. Next slide.
I do want to ask one from Nikki on Zoom.
Yeah.
Was organizing done across languages?
Steve.
I believe this was a very English speaking at this time in New England, that there weren't French Canadians, there weren't Celtic speaking Irish immigrants or Germans. I'm pretty sure it was mostly an English speaking thing.
Yes, I think that the big immigration of Europeans did not start until later. All right, next slide. So we do also need to talk a little bit about some of the unique conditions here in America. One of which was the existence of the frontier. So we had a Mike Davis essay for the reading, which points out that the plebeian colonial masses did not rise up under the leadership of their planter and mercantile revolutionaries in 1776 to ignite a worldwide revolution, as the sans-culottes, followers of Saint-Just and Robespierre, would aspire to do a few years later, but rather to defend the special gift of popular liberty that God and John Locke granted their Puritan ancestors. Next slide. With the exception of the New England valleys, Lowell, which is in Massachusetts, and the older eastern port cities, boomtowns like Pittsburgh and Cleveland arose without those deep roots in the artisanal resistance to industrialism, which many historians have stressed as a determining factor in the formation of militant unionism and working class organizations. Moreover, is this expanding urban industrial frontier, rather than ternarian agrarian frontier, with its constantly replenished opportunities for small-scale entrepreneurial accumulation that provided material sustenance for the petty bourgeois ideologies of individual mobility that gripped the minds of so many American workers. American laborers, to a far greater extent than workers in European industrial nations, vote with their feet against oppressive working conditions, as all too frequently geographical mobility became a surrogate for collective action. So yeah, we have this idea that you can't escape society, but in this period in America, you kind of could. If you didn't like the opportunities where you were living, you could move west, and there would be different jobs, or possibly even a small plot of land you could sell, which engenders a very different form of consciousness than these European societies where the frontier did not exist. You're basically stuck where you were, and if you wanted things to change, you had to fight for it. So yeah, next slide. But what did happen with the frontier is that it eventually filled up. And that brings us to 1877, next slide, when the Great Upheaval officially starts. This scene of this burning railroad depot happened during the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which was one of the first big industrial strikes in America. Next slide. So yeah, this started in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and spread along the railroad lines, which at this point were pretty much all newly built, across the Midwest, all the way to Illinois and Missouri. This happened in response to a recession, which will be a pattern that we'll see emerging in this period. And it involved widespread property destruction. The authorities were genuinely scared that this was going to turn into a Paris Commune style armed uprising. Paris Commune was 1871, I believe, so this was still very recent memory. Like with the Lowell Mill people, these were not workers that were organized into unions. They were workers that walked off the job because they were sick of bad working conditions and bad pay. So once again, we see that we do not need new leadership or intellectuals or workers to get the idea that, hey, maybe we should walk off the job and demand that. The state has great difficulty bringing this strike under control, in no small part because they were relying on militias, which were made up of local citizens at this point. And when they called these militias out, many of them either deserted or joined the strikers. So they had to scramble for reliable troops. And they would learn this lesson very well. This changed the face of American policing. More regular police were hired. Capitalists started to use private security, the Pinkertons or the Baldwins, to protect their property a lot more. And the militias were reformed so that they would be more reliable, putting down strikes like this. But it was eventually brought under control. There was no Third American Revolution. Next slide. There would be more unrest in not that long though. There was another recession in the early 1880s. And when that happened, workers started flooding into this organization called the Knights of Labor. This was not specifically a labor union. They did support the right of workers to organize, but it also included many middle class elements, and they had visions for reform that went beyond just labor issues. It was a very big tent organization, much like some of the preceding social movements that we've learned about, utopian socialists and the abolitionists. This organization had strong moral and religious overtones. I think it also coincided with the great religious awakening that happened around this time. They did support and won several major strikes against Stephen Jay Gould's railroad mines, but what they were not able to do was to procure a lasting organizational structure or define their aims sharply enough that they could last. And unfortunately, after this like huge growth in the 1880s, the organization flamed out pretty quick. But its ambitions and its radical inclusiveness, it organized skilled workers, unskilled workers, women, people of all races and ethnicities, which was very uncommon at this time, would be an example for future labor organizers. You can see in their logo, the slogan, "An injured one is the concern of all," that would be modified later by other labor organizations and become a watchword for labor. So despite its short life, this organization is very. Next slide. We now move on to probably the most famous labor action in American history, maybe one of the most famous ones in world history, the Haymarket Affair. We have a quote from Lucy Parsons here, whose husband was arrested, tried, and executed for his role in this strike. What happened was the Chicago labor movement all struck for the 8-hour working day, which has been a demand of the labor movement pretty much since it started. The AFL, I think, originally spearheaded the strike, but everyone got As the meeting was breaking up, police moved aggressively to disperse what remained of the people there. Someone responded by throwing a bomb at them, which killed several people. And that became the justification for the arrest of 8 anarchists, none of whom were actually involved with making or throwing the bomb, as far as I know. 7 were sentenced to death. I think 4 were actually executed. 1 committed suicide. And while these people were later seen as martyrs, the effect of the propaganda and just getting them off the streets was enough to break the back of the social. And the use of the courts in this way, the state basically later admitted this trial had been a frame up when they pardoned 2 of the remaining prisoners. And the use of the courts in this way to break up social movements is another theme that we'll see come back during this period. Next slide. Next strike is a little bit different actually, because it did not happen in response to a recession, unlike the other 2, but the 3 that we've discussed so far. This was a strike by the Amalgamated Steelworkers Union, which was a union of skilled steelworkers. So this was what's called a trade or craft union. These are unions that organize skilled workers. For their leverage, they rely not so much on broad solidarity, but on the control that these skilled workers have over the labor process. Basically, they know how to do their job and their boss does not, which gives them a lot more autonomy than many other workers. But in the Carnegie Steelworks, they had been displaced by some new technology which made it possible to produce steel more efficiently and without the labor of these skilled workers. So even though steel production got more efficient, the workers were offered wage cuts because they were no longer necessary to do this skilled labor, which they were not happy about. They went on strike for months. This was extremely militant. The workers pretty much organized themselves on military lines, but with Pinkertons for control of what they called Fort Frick, which was this factory that Carnegie's enforcer, Robert Frick, I believe, had pretty much turned into a fort in anticipation of battling these strikers. Now, despite the intense militancy that these workers displayed, the strike was eventually broken, and that is because, for reasons we discussed earlier, they had very little economic leverage. They could be replaced by non-union workers and this new technology, so the company did not really have to negotiate with them. And they were also undermined because these trade or craft unions tended to focus on very narrow interests, and they could not motivate the same sort of broad solidarity that demand the 8-hour day, which applied to pretty much all workers, would be able to. Now, some people watch this and they learn lessons. Next slide. One of those people was Eugene Debs, who founded the American Railway Union. This included both skilled and unskilled workers, and included workers that both worked on the trains and in the factory that made train cars. And when Goldman cut wages but left the prices in his company town the same, as you can see this political cartoon, that was very funny. The workers in both the train, on both the train and the factory went on strike. While this was broken, again, with the use of a court injunction, it was able to bring the Pullman company to a stop for several days without violence. Whereas with the Homestead affair, you see that it depended basically entirely on workers being able to hold that factory against competence. This could use economic leverage. However, while this union was inclusive of both skilled and unskilled workers, it was still segregated. And so the Pullman company was able to use black strike breakers as well as the court's jailbreak strike. Next slide. So yeah, that's sort of a very short highlight reel of the labor actions that took place during this Great Upheaval period. There were many more of them, but I don't have time to go through all of them now. However, given this sample, what worker organizing strategies do we feel are most effective and which ones do we think are ineffective? Based on the results that they got.
I mean, it kind of seems like the broader the sort of like demographical tent per se, the more effective the strike, you know. Like whether they had like more skilled, you know, like not just skilled workers or not just unskilled workers, they had like, you know, consolidated like demands, you know what I'm saying, like actual like goals in mind. They were able to strike for longer and strike like harder, or however you want to put it, versus like, yeah, like the very little economic leverage and just like intense militancy of the steelworkers strike. I mean, like this lasted a long time, but it was broken, and it seems like they didn't really win anything in the end. Versus like, yeah, right.
Yeah, that was the end of that strike was not only did they not win anything, but that was like basically death for that.
Right.
They were completely driven out of it. So yeah, totally agree with that. Anyone else?
That's not necessarily a strategy that they use, but kind of the time is that like the courts were more so in favor of the capitalist owners, and they were able to just utilize that to be like, hey, these people are doing something bad, can we get rid of them or throw them in jail? So kind of less protection for the people on strike.
Yeah, I mean, part of that, the reason that strategy was so effective was that the legislature hadn't made any labor laws, but yes, definitely. The courts, they be very reactionary.
Yeah.
In the back.
Sort of along the lines of what the first person said, inclusivity in the action and not just in terms of skilled and unskilled labor, but also especially taking into reference the racial situation with American capitalism, especially because considering, I think at that time, Black workers were a lot cheaper to hire too. They were in many situations used as strike breakers, and because labor unions were segregated, capitalism ends up being able to take our racial tensions and use it to its advantage.
Yeah, definitely. Capitalists will throw the racial ideology straight out the window. It's comes in conflict with their bottom line. In the back, on the right-ish.
This was the second comment. Also, I think it is important to remember that American labor history is probably the most brutal and violent in the world. With maybe Australia as another one, but just really, really, really violent repression. And it's worth remembering. I mean, I think like, you know, organizers respond to their situation, but I do think that's part of, to go back to the earlier point that was made about, you know, kind of socialist ideology and why socialists in part started thinking about like the labor movement in some sort of relationship to politics, was in part because the strength of the political forces to repress the labor movement were used very intensely in the US.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And we will talk more about that in just a little bit. We're talking about the Socialist Party. All the way in the back.
Yeah, no, so this is kind of more of a question. I mean, I think that like the railroad strikes, the 1877 and the Pullman strike were both the most effective because they're like in really strategic lines, hard to replace jobs, and it really like hits capital in many different directions. But I guess my question is like, what made the Pullman strike more effective? Like what kind of went into that strike that because that's the impression I got based on some of the information you were saying. So I wonder if you could kind of expand on that.
My take on why it was more successful is first of all, it was able to use just economic leverage to bring Pullman Corporation to a stop temporarily, which, as we saw with the Homestead strike, wasn't always feasible for unions at this point. I also think that the Pullman strike had a longer legacy. We will hear more about this in just a little while, but Debs was inspired by this strike to take up political work with the Socialist Party and also in his work with the IWW, which would come in just a few years. So yeah, I think even though it failed, people involved with it saw the potential for the strategies they used to work, if applied even more forcefully. Whereas like the Homestead strike is pretty much, there's no like positive message you can take away from that. They fought really hard and they still lost. Hate to see it. Hope that helps. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
so in the 1877 strike, there's a lot of solidarity with Black workers and immigrants, and it's kind of interesting. I've read articles that said it's kind of connected to the end of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, as maybe like a divide and conquer type strategy, because they're so freaked out by the strike. I don't know, like
yeah, I think that we did talk about this some last time.
I think so.
Like, yeah, the end of Reconstruction definitely helps to fragment the working class into racial categories, and like I think that was a drag on labor organizing by and large during this period. The immigration thing also did complicate matters quite a bit, but there were many successful efforts to yeah. Yeah, sorry.
I'm not remembering the details, but I remember being told in college a long time ago that Debs had actually argued against mounting the Pullman strike because he believed that it would not succeed and it would end up destroying the union, which it did. Do you know why he thought that? Or
I actually do not know what his role was in calling the strike. I
he was
do know.
against it, but when they voted to do it, he led it. But
Yeah, so yeah, it was a democratic decision by the union to go on strike. And I do also know that when he was faced with the use of police force and the court injunction, he did move to call it off, because, well, he thought that people would probably continue it. He did not think that they could. And that was part of the reason that he later tried to found the IWW and the Socialist Party to sort of make up for some of the deficits that defeated that Pullman strike. Couple more up there. Carrington.
I think it's interesting that some of us want to answer the question of what capitalist organizing strategies were not effective during this great upheaval, because at least from the Davis analysis, I mean, or from what you presented, like everything ended up, not succeeding in the end, or the unions were crushed. And one of the things was getting the skilled laborers to leave, right? The union, or taking leadership with that, really effective leadership and co-opting them and like having them join legislator office or legislative work. And apparently they did not come up with a response to that. So I guess that is like a strategy that did not work. Or they were kind of handed like in the face of that. And I don't know, I mean, I guess we still see that today. And so that's a question for us today, like how do we deal with like attrition in the ranks?
Yeah, We will talk more about some of the like different union ideologies just a little while, which I touch on some of that. One or two more, but that's comments. Is there anyone on Zoom? Okay. You, and then.
You mentioned that some of them were anarchists, and I guess I'm curious, was that the political aspirations of most of them, or did they not even necessarily consider like political life? Were they mostly just focused on their immediate labor situations, or did they like they subscribe to anarchism, or want to try and merge it with democracy in some way? Or?
We will talk about this more in just a second. I would say that the anarchists were a minority, but they were also a significant force within labor organizing at this point. And they were one that emerged sort of before the socialists really got rolling. They were much more influential in the Haymarket era than the socialists were. Yeah, last comment from someone over there.
Was it me or it was you? Okay. So yeah, I mean, people have already pointed out what I thought was kind of important here is that none of these succeeded. But beyond that, it seems like perhaps, it's colored a little bit by the fact of the, highlights that you collected. But all these seem to be defensive rights. The capitalists initiate some retrenchment, some, removal of privileges, or, decreasing wages, increasing rent. And workers either, spin an organization that's sort of barely existing enough and push it forward to react. Or, they had a pre-existing organization, but it was kind of laying dormant for a moment. And I'm curious about, was that really all that was happening during this Great Upheaval period? It was purely reactions to, capitalist industrialization is advancing, and it creates a cyclical pattern of, taking something away from workers and they have to respond. Over the workers in their own right, developing something that was pushing in the opposite direction independently, or is that sort of foreshadowing what you're about to talk about?
Yeah, I was actually gonna say that leads perfectly into my next thing, which is about the period following this, where you see less dramatic, like spontaneous outbursts like this, but what you do see is people trying to form long-lasting organizations, and like take a more thought-out long-term approach to reform. And what we're going to talk about next is some of these reform movements and organizations that rose up during what's called the progressive era. So next slide. Here we have three of the non-socialist ones. I will say that probably all of these made a bigger splash with the American population than socialism ever did. But since this is a class about socialism, we're giving them one slide. So first you have populism. This was a farmer and small business dominated movement that rose up right around the same time as the Pullman strike did. Pictured is Williams Jennings Bryan, who ran for president on the populist ticket when they formed their political party. Now, populists were generally pro-labor organizing, but since they were dominated by the middle class, which had big problems with debt at this time, their main issue was they wanted an expansionary monetary policy, which was to reduce the value of the debt farmers and small businessmen were carrying. So that's good for them, but it is not good for wage workers who are basically living hand to mouth. And this expansionary monetary policy would cause inflation, which would raise prices for them, but probably not get them. So that one never really took off with workers. And as the power of small farmers and small businessmen continued to decline in the face of big capital, the party kind of like fell apart. We also had progressivism. This was the progressive age. This was probably the most successful, or at least the party that managed to grab the most credit for the reforms in this era. This was also very middle class and elite dominated. Progressives had a very elite driven theory of change. Basically, they thought that like either enlightened elites or these like technocratic professional class could manage society more effectively and create positive social change more effectively than social movements and the class struggle. So, I mean, even today, if you think about the difference between I've got a plan for that as a political slogan or not me, us, that's kind of the difference right there to me, and there is somewhat to this day. Now these progressives, they did win a lot of very positive things. They were instrumental in getting women to vote, public education, sanitation, and healthcare reforms. But they could be suspicious of unions, mass political action, and even democracy. Walter Lippmann, a famous progressive, has this quote that democracy is too important to be trusted to the people, and that's like, yeah, kind of their mindset. Also, like, pretty into race science. Picture Nelson, who, as we now know, was pretty racist. And we also, on the far right here, have Samuel Gompers, who's the head of the AFL. He was a big proponent of what he called pure and simple. This ideology sees unions as a feature of the capitalist system. They want to cultivate a friendly negotiating relationship with managers, and they tended to be hostile to political affiliations for unions, or like reformist ambitions, and they would fight quite a bit with the more radical wing of the union movement, because they felt that the radicals were damaging the cordial relationship with capitalists, whereas the radicals thought these guys were not militant enough, rolling over for oppression. So that would be, I would say that the pure and simple unionism was more prevalent at this time, although radical unionism was certainly significant. And also that the pure and simple unionists were instrumental in winning stuff like the 8-hour day and better conditions for their workers. So even though we as socialists may have grander ambitions for the labor movement than they do, they're not bad by any means. This is still workers organizing to advance their own interests. Still think that's next slide. Now we do have socialism in America at this time. As I said earlier, after the Pullman strike, Eugene Debs was introduced to socialist literature by a guy called Victor Berger, who was an Austrian immigrant who lived in Milwaukee, and became convinced that workers needed to take political action in order to liberate themselves. He founded the Socialist Party to help them do exactly that. This party elected 2 US representatives, including Meyer London, who actually represented the Lower East Side, so right here. And they elected many more state and local officials. Eugene Debs ran for president several times. He got almost 1 million votes in the 1912 election, about 6%. So not close to winning, but definitely a respectable minority showing. The sewer socialists in Milwaukee, Victor Berger's territory, were known to be a particularly effective political machine. They pretty much dominated local politics in Milwaukee throughout this period. And this Socialist Party, like I said, respectable minority, but still very much minority. So what they did often was work in coalition with progressive reformers to get reforms they could all agree on. Even though they had this sort of, what I think is a very profound difference in their theory of change, and their outlook on certain things, they did work together. Next slide. We also have in this period the founding of the International Workers of the World, which really took union radicalism to the max. They believed that all workers should be organized into one union. So like the biggest possible industrial union approach you can imagine. They had strong political affiliations with both anarchists and communists, or socialists at this time. And they tended to organize workers that the AFL, with its more crack union focused outlook, wouldn't touch. And they got up to like, I think, 750,000 members during this time, and had involvement from G. Debs, from Mother Jones, from Lucy Parsons, a who's who of American labor radicals. And yeah, have here their preamble for their constitution, which, you know, is a textbook socialist. Working class and employing class have nothing. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among the millions of working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things. Between these two classes, a struggle must go on until the workers of the organized class take possession of the means for abolish the wage system, live in harmony with the earth. These conditions can be changed and the interest of the working class upheld only by an organization formed in such a way that all its members in any one industry or in all industries, if necessary, cease work whenever a strike will knock out on in any department thereof, thus making an injury to one an injury to all, which calls back to the Knights of Labor slogan, slightly modified than heard earlier. Next slide. So yeah, we've been through various reform movements, both labor unions, political parties, social movements in this period. We see some things in common, we see some differences. What do we feel distinguishes socialist thought from some of the other non-socialist movements that were active at this time?
Yeah, I mean, the clear thing with this is that it's organizing along class lines, right? So we're talking about earlier with the Goldman strike and like the reasons why that was ineffective. You know, a large part of that I would expect would be that you had like black people as strike breakers because they were not organizing along class lines. And the idea of this IWW, as far as I'm aware, was the first union to actually like allow black people, black workers into the union.
Yes, that is true. I think the Socialist Party also advocated desegregation, although there was some dispute about that within both the Labor and the Socialist Party. Jerry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say about populism, I'm not totally sure I agree entirely with like, I mean, it may be true a little bit, monetary policy distinguished them, although, you know, ultimately state could do a lot more monetary policy as people found out in the Great Depression. I think one of the big things that distinguished them was like a rural versus an urban base. So like populism, I mean, played a super important role in fighting Jim Crow and in sort of maybe being a possible alternative to how things would have turned out in the South. But its base largely, which both African American and white generally were farmers. And I do think like, though there was some attempts in the party to unify an urban and a rural base, the base the socialists had was much more urban based. And actually, I think that's like a tension and a kind of a characteristic of politics, which I still think is somewhat relevant for us to think about, like strong urban bases that have a lot of power and are super progressive, but also like the question of the countryside, which looks a little different now, but you know, still relevant.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with that. And I think that the focus on monetary policy came from having this mostly rural base because the big problem was debt, not low wages. So sorry if I did not get that across as effectively as I could have. Yeah, all the way in the back and then.
Yeah,
I think that's a good point, Jeremy, and I know the IWW kind of tried like an agricultural workers organizing thing, and was kind of like a mixed success and not their most successful venture. I think a big thing here, like going back to your slide where you had like progressivism and other ideologies, you could just put above all of those imperialism. This was an age where the US became like a global empire. I mean, during this whole time, and of course, there's the genocidal empire forming of inside the continental US, but 1896, you have the Spanish American War, you have the annexation of Hawaii. These things really start to have like the US play like an imperial role on the world stage. And I think progressivism, all those ideologies are really, really in favor of empire, strongly in favor of going to war in World War I, and the big thing that distinguishes and actually splits the socialist movement during that time is opposition to empire and opposition to imperialism. And I think something that's like just held by a lot of these, by a lot of the kind of leftist movements of these times is that kind of opposition to the global color line, as well as like opposition to white supremacy within the US, although that's not something they always keep to very well.
Yeah, that is true, and I think we'll probably hear more about that when we get to the Red Scare, which we're sort of running short on time, so we should probably get there as soon as we can. A few more comments on this. Yeah.
This one? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
and then right above you.
This is probably rather maybe an obvious point by now, but the main difference I think is the fact that the Socialist Party and socialists in general argue for workers themselves owning the means of production, and I guess to compare more so with pure and simple unionism and progressivism. So long as the capitalists still own the means of production, they'll continue to accumulate profit and in turn, try to use these resources in order to extinguish the unions and, these limitations to their profits. And then with progressivism, like, so long as you elect progressives in, maybe you'll have that in structure power from the government to defend you, but also the moment that progressives get voted out, then you're completely fucked because they're not really trying to be more democratic and push in a more radical manner.
Yeah. One more comment. So, yeah.
That's just to be very basic about it. The socialist and anarchist movement were not elite-led.
Yes.
Right? These were real. I mean, there were some elite people that joined it, but these were really came up from the workers and.
As we discussed, the Socialist Party was founded by union members, partly because of the failures of the Goldman strike. The Socialist Party and the union movement did come straight out of the class. Next slide. So this is a photo from the Goldman strike. Before I hand it over to Jamie to give us bad news, which is that most of the gains from this period were rolled back during that scare, we're going to talk about some of the positive stuff that happened during this period, which is, first of all, I think there were a diversity of reform movements that, while they had internal issues that did hamper them, managed to retain independent political identities and still work together to achieve a lot of very meaningful reforms. Also, despite the brutal organizing environment that we saw in some of our examples and that Jeremy mentioned in his response to one of the questions, union membership went from 0 to I think around 20% of the workforce, around 5 million between 1877 and 1920. Despite people routinely being injured and killed by Pinkertons and cops on these labor actions, people kept doing it, kept working. And yet, some of the reforms we got from this are things we might take for granted today. Women's suffrage, public education, the 8-hour working day, the end of child labor, all won in large part because of the class struggle that happened during this time. So good things are happening. So there's going to be a big reaction. And to talk about that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-presenter, David.
Okay, I feel like we're gonna go a little bit over because we have 15 minutes left and I want time for discussion. But we'll see how it goes. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm gonna talk about the first Red Scare, not the podcast, people, the political event in history. So there were many factors that led to this. As Peter was telling you about, there was a ton of radical labor activity by the IWW and other unions. They were getting members. They were incorporating immigrants, women, Black people, all kinds of things that are really scary if you're trying to enforce the power of capital. There was World War I that inspired a lot of nationalism on the part of the government and, the heavily propagandized population. There was the Russian Revolution of 1917, pretty important, I would say. And it got the ruling class of the US very scared of something like that happening here. There were some race riots in 1919 when Black people actually began fighting back against racist violence. And the Bolsheviks were blamed, of course, the Reds. The woke New York Times headline said, Reds try to stir Negroes to revolt. Obviously the Reds were on the side of Black people, Black workers, but they didn't give them the idea necessarily. We had a lot of nativism and xenophobia, which was sort of a knockoff effect of this hyper-nationalism. And yeah, the word scare, like the Jacobin article says, implies a hysteria or paranoia. But there was a very real, very radical, very organized movement, class movement. And the goal was to crush it forever. There were, in addition to all the strikes, there were insurrectionary activities, there were some bombings, there was anti-war activism, which the powers that be did not like. There was a genuine battle happening over the means of production, over, is capitalism going to continue, or are the workers going to take control of the world? So the stakes were very high, and it was an incredibly violent struggle with casualties on both sides, both the side of the workers and the side of the capitalists, which is to say the side of the people that the capitalists paid to fight for them, although they did get a few as well, the capitalists and they did the president. All right, next slide. All right, so this is America, right? First, we need the laws, we need the precedent, we need some legal framework to do the Red Scare. So, yeah, it was not clear that capital was going to win this fight on its own. So here we see the state stepping in to make some laws, suddenly those liberal values, these American values, all that good stuff in the Bill of Rights, we're going to put that on the back burner. So we have the Espionage Act of 1917, which banned any activities that might interfere with the war effort, disrupt recruitment, quote unquote, aid the enemy, which could be as simple as like speaking out against the war. We had the Sedition Act of 1918, which covered a broader range of anti-war activities. Okay, so this is the one that made it as simple as speaking out against the war. Right. The Immigration Act, 1918, enabled the government to deport undesirable aliens, especially anarchists, communists, and labor organizers. And we had a lot of state-level criminal syndicalism laws. Sounds like they're going after the mafia, but no, they're going after anarchists and communists, once again, made it a crime to advocate, even advocate, this is again, speech, right? Advocating the use of any illegal tactic to bring about political or economic change. This could be violence, this could be sabotage, this could be, you know, simply speech, once again. And a lot of these laws are spearheaded by progressive liberals. Boo. Okay, next slide. So now they have the laws, they're gonna do the repression. So what happened then? These are just some examples. There are a lot more. I encourage you all to look them up later. But what did they do? They expelled 5 socialists from the New York State Assembly. Now, this inspired some debate between our bourgeois politicians as to whether or not that was a good move. Some of them were like, yes, their ideas are too dangerous. They cannot be in these positions where they have a platform. Other people were like, well, if we take them out of the official system, they're just going to do, you know, crimes and whatnot. So maybe we need to give them this, you know, let them get it out of their systems or whatever. So that was kind of interesting. It made me think about electoralism as a strategy. 1920, we have the Palmer raids in 30 cities aimed at anarchist and communist groups. These raids, oh, what happened to my picture? All right, that's sad. What it is. The raids, they were named for the Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, who President Wilson had kind of given carte blanche to go after these labor radicals. So all in all, about 10,000 leftists were arrested, hundreds were deported or criminally prosecuted, and hundreds went to prison and did some serious time. And now when the state did this, it fought dirty, right? They did not really, again, abide by the liberal values upon this nation which this nation was supposedly founded. There was oftentimes scanty evidence. There was false testimony given by government witnesses. They would blacklist the lawyers for representing any defendants in these cases. And they would even prosecute defense witnesses. So, you know, again, not exactly a scrupulous fight, not exactly a fair fight. Oh yes, and there were even a few guys who made their living as professional witnesses for a while, one of whom was a Klansman. So that's nice. They also imprisoned many pacifists and religious objectors, along with the real, you know, fire radicals. The Red Scare kind of petered out in 1920 when there was allegedly going to be a big revolution happening on May Day, but it did not. However, the repression did continue into the mid-1920s, and it was fairly effective. It left the movement in tatters. The IWW really never recovered from it. This is not the only reason the IWW collapsed, but it really wore the union down, put it in a defensive posture, stressed everyone out, cost a lot of money, lost a lot of people to jail and deportations. And yeah, maybe the split that happened later, people would have been a little bit nicer to each other if they weren't so stressed out by all this. What else? Oh yes, so here are some case studies of some people. Of course, every single person who got caught up in this was important, but you know, we like our figureheads. So one of the people was Eugene Debs. Now, Peter told you a little bit about him. He was imprisoned, and he was the Socialist Party presidential candidate. He's imprisoned under the Sedition Act for speaking out. He spoke out against the war. He got arrested a couple times. He did a couple stints in prison. But he ran for president from prison and got almost 1 million votes, which is pretty cool. He was sentenced to 10 years. He served about 3 of them. Next slide. You know what, we can skip that, but I just think it's a good quote from Eugene Debs' sentencing hearing. People like to quote this from him, that's where it's from. You can read it yourselves. Next slide. All right, so another person who got caught up in this was Emma Goldman. She was an influential Russian-born anarchist and labor activist. She wrote on many topics, including anarchist philosophy, labor, women's rights, social issues, free love, very fun stuff on free love. She was an early supporter of birth control as well as LGBT rights at a time when not a lot of people, even on the left, really cared about that. She was a feminist. She distanced herself from the suffragists of the time because she did not think participation in the bourgeois political system was any kind of route to liberation, but she was definitely her own kind of feminist. And yeah, she advocated for social revolution for any means necessary. In 17, she was arrested for speaking out against the draft, 2 years in prison. She was arrested in the Palmer raids, deported in 1918, along with her partner, Alexander Berkman, under the Anarchist Exclusion Act, which allowed any non-citizens to be deported simply for being anarchists. So again, you know, not so much with the freedom of speech. And here's a quote from J. Edgar Hoover, who said, "Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman are, beyond doubt, two of the most dangerous anarchists in this country, and return to the community will result in undue harm." Now, was he telling the truth? Next slide. So yeah, here are some things that she believed in. So Emma Goldman, among other things, believed in propaganda of the deed, which is to say, political direct action meant to inspire others to further acts of revolution. Now, people tend to focus on the violent examples, but there are also non-violent versions of direct action. You can think about property destruction. You can think about sabotage, which is a thing workers sometimes engaged in at the time. Strikes, illegal strikes, all of that stuff. Anything, it could be anything that's not mediated by, you know, the parliamentary process or what have you. She never explicitly endorsed the assassination of President McKinley, but she did write that these acts were a natural consequence of repressive institutions. Quote, "The accumulated forces in our social and economic life culminating in an act of violence are similar to the terrors of the atmosphere, manifested in storm and lightning." That is from The Psychology of Political Violence. She did plot with her partner Berkman to assassinate the wealthy industrialist Henry Frick. We heard about him in the last segment. And it wasn't just for no reason. It wasn't like, let's take out a random capitalist because we don't like him. No. During the Homestead Steel Strike, he evicted families from their homes, and he hired Pinkertons to murder workers, including some children. So they really were at war here, and they believed that killing Frick would send a message to the other side. Berkman wound up actually shooting Frick 3 times, but he survived. You know, unfortunately. Emma Goldman said on the act, quote, "A blow aimed at Frick would re-echo in the forest hubble, would call the attention of the whole world to the real cause behind the Homestead struggle. It would also strike terror in the enemy's ranks and make them realize that the proletariat of America had its avengers." Yeah, she did not mince words. And you know, apparently after she got deported to Russia, while after that, she initially supported the revolution in Russia, but then she had some criticisms of the state that resulted. But we're not there yet. As this presentation ends when she leaves the country. So here are some discussion questions. And I'm gonna do this a little differently. And you know what? I think that works well with the lack of time that we have. So I have brought up some topics. What lessons, if any, can we take from all this? And you can answer that however you like, perhaps with the help of these topics in the next slide, or not, if you don't want to. Did capital and the state achieve what they wanted with the first Red Scare? What is the role of war in upholding global capitalism? What do you think of these arguments among bourgeois politicians for or against expelling the socialists from office? Propaganda of the deed, how do we feel about that? Are there parallels with the present day? Could this type of violent conflict and violent repression come back? How are things the same? How are they different? So, yeah.
Hi, that last topic, definitely like kind of rings out in my mind. There's a comrade in Atlanta recently who wanted to discuss a possible upcoming like illegal period, you know, with like the DSA, just as kind of, you know, like the largest socialist organization in the country. I don't know what we can learn from it, but I think that it's important to say that there are things that can be learned, right? I mean, right now we do have like a pretty important, like, you know, workers movement maybe developing in this country. You know, you have like large corporations like employees of Starbucks, you know, organizing, and like Amazon workers and things. Like there are hopefully, like, you know, optimistically, like the bubblings of like a workers movement in this country that are starting right now. I would say we're before a period like in the early 1900s, you know what I'm saying? I don't think we're quite at a point where we're like parallel with that yet, but I think if we want to be like tactical about that in any capacity, we should understand that if things continue in the way that they are, an illegal period is kind of on the horizon, right? For the DSA, and like how can we learn from here, you know, like what worked and what didn't to like weather that better than a lot of the most powerful like socialist groups and like worker movement groups in this era did, because they did very well, right? Like the Red Scare is pretty effective.
Yeah, it definitely scares me a little bit. I'm like, oh, thank you.
Right.
Just a little guy. Yeah, I think there's parallels today, like what you said about that kind of shocked me a bit that I didn't know about, was like the expulsion of 5 socialists from the New York State Assembly, which kind of parallels today with the Tennessee legislator. Three of them were voted to get kicked out, 2 actually did. I think 1 got reinstated from the county, but essentially the fact of representatives standing with the people is a cause for them to get voted out, and that, which essentially is kind of scary because that their job is to represent their people, and they're like, no, you can't do that. So yeah,
for sure. To kind of address what you were talking about the possibility of an illegal period in socialism in America, I think something that stands out as a little bit different now versus then is that so much of the Red Scare was based in xenophobia and us against them, and anyone in the country who was, you know, of a different political persuasion must belong to outsiders and could be expelled. Whereas today it's much more split along party lines, much more split along like kind of an inner turmoil of the country. So I wonder if something to learn from the past is to emphasize that the unity of the country around socialism rather than an us versus them type of mentality. So.
Yeah, first of all, it's a great deal. Anyway, I think one thing I took away from our whole presentation is, you know, not only do we sort of oppose all these horrible things as racism, sexism, xenophobia on humanistic grounds, which I think is good and correct, but there's another layer there where, like, quite literally, this is what just destroyed us. And it's like us fighting against that is not only being good humanitarians, being good people, which we should be, it's also being good socialists by fighting these things. If there's one lesson I drove from today, it's that.
For sure. Peter.
I'm gonna go no on propaganda of the deed, at least as it relates to terrorism. My impression was that the assassination attempt on Peck actually helped turn people against the strikers. And same with the bombing at Haymarket, it became this grist for anti-union propaganda justification for crackdowns. So yeah, I think that while Emma Goldman was one of our great all-time radicals, she
I wanted to give first a little bit more context on the propaganda of the deed. The propaganda of the deed was like a very central idea in Russian anarchism, in the end of 19th century, like the people who killed Alexander II and then tried to assassinate Alexander III, they were anarchists, and like this, what they did was part of the propaganda of the deed. But I think that propaganda of the deed generally can be seen if it's like violence and assassination and terrorism. That's something that I think is most of the time is bad, but there is a propaganda of the deed where like organizing, where like seeing more socially electeds. This is also something that can be conceptualized as the propaganda of the deed, and in that way it can be something good. And it seems generally the propaganda of the deed is something for more dire times. For example, in Russia right now, with Putin's regime, there was this terrorist attack on one of the warriors from a private war company. And this is something that I think is actually very good for Russia right now. But I think for the place where we are right now in American history, this kind of violence, I think, is uncalled for. And then I also wanted to say that one of the biggest lessons for me from this is that not to forget that this is actually a class war and expect the capitalist class to fight back. So whatever gains we have, it's not something that we can just feel good about and stop organizing. There's always need for more organizing, more participation, even after we get some big gains like new electeds or new legislature. So like to expect the capitalists to fight back.
Yeah, for sure. Gotta keep our eyes on the prize. All the way in the back.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to emphasize here, like, if there's one thing that when we're thinking about this, just remember there are political prisoners in America. You know, there's anarchists who are still in prison. There's people who were arrested in 2020 in the George Floyd uprising, in the pretty Great Uprising in Baltimore that are still in prison. There are political prisoners. So if we're thinking about this, if there's one thing to take from this lesson, I think really is to go home and look. You know, you can search New York City Anarchist Black Cross or Movement Support, find their names, find their addresses, and you can write to them, you can learn how to support them. There are political prisoners, and the tactics they're using, I mean, there's that quote from J. Edgar Hoover, that wasn't like him writing in the 50s, that was him writing like 1919, he's using the same, he's such an evil person, right? He starts in the tactics he's using then, he uses it directly against the Black Panthers in the 60s, the same tactics he uses against Marcus Garvey's movement in the 20s, you know, undercover agents, like false stories in the media, deportations, exactly the same tactics in the 60s, right? We can learn from this repression, but we also need to remember that this is still happening, it's still going on, and there's political prisoners right now, and their names are not in the news. It's not just the people you know, expelled in the Tennessee legislature. There's people being prosecuted by Biden right now. They're not in the news, and we should remember that and figure out how we can support them.
Absolutely. Yeah, a friend of mine is one. Actually, I think he's going to do a few years in jail, which sucks. But yeah, the level of repression, though, like I did not mean to imply that we do not have that now, but I think the level of repression and the level of violence is really shocking. Like we talk, you know, debate about like, was it bad to like throw rocks at the cops or whatever? And like, you know, this is really intense what was going on back then. Oh God, I can't see any of you. Jeremy.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. I think these are all great questions. It's like, so a few thoughts. One, you know, this is maybe me being a little Pollyanna-ish, but to the first question, like, the answer is like, sorta. So like, I mean, yes, they set the movement back. Yes, they did a lot to screw things up, but also like, in some sense, to me, like part of the point of studying this history is recognizing ourselves as a part of it. And so if their goal was to permanently destroy class conflict or radicalism or socialists, like, no, they were not successful because here we are in this room. And I think that's like important perspective to have about, you know, their power is heavy, but like also there's more of us than there are of them ultimately in the history of the world. And it's good to like draw strength from that.
Agreed.
A Passover lesson.
For sure. Okay, you down there, next to Jeremy.
Me? Okay, yeah, no, I really agree with, what you said, and I think that like, one thing that interests me is that, you know, like, they went after like certain socialists, and it's not like they got rid of all the trade unionists, like, you know, like, I think that it's probably important to take into account kind of role played by like elements within the worker movement also in enabling repression. And I think that it, in present day, like, the ruling class, I think, has like ways of monitoring and repressing us that probably outpace what they had before. But at the same time, there's like historical examples like the German SPD, which showed that like socialists can organize legally. They have done so, and if anything, that under those conditions, it might help us become like stronger in terms of developing as an actual socialist party. And also, I think that like the ruling class, they use the Red Scare, they use these moments of repression because they're scared of like class struggle. And by the very action of like engaging in terror, I think they also run the risk of kind of igniting sections of the working class. So I think that, you know, like, we have to take all that into account and just be ready for anything and be ready to fight regardless. So
Yeah, for sure. Way in the back.
Well, yeah, just to build on that, I mean, I think I personally think that absolutely, if the left gets stronger, radical left gets stronger, there will be repression. It's predictable. I think that the thing that we need to think about today is that so much of the organizing and so much of the presence is now taking place on these social media platforms and other platforms that are proprietary property of these corporations, and they do cooperate with the state. And, you know, there was a time not so long ago when you could go underground. And, you know, people did that. And so I think that there's if we get to that point, which we want to get to, there is going to be a whole set of other considerations about how you actually deal with that onslaught. Because it will happen if we gain strength. It's absolutely, it always does.
Yeah. For sure. Oh.
So with the parallels to today, one of the things I was thinking of was if there was some kind of common material basis for which industries like were fertile for the strikes that happened. And I couldn't really think of one other than that they seem to be like highly central to production and maybe like heavy industries. So I don't understand exactly how that would translate to today. Like one of the industries now might be like the service industry, because that's so dominant in the United States now, but I kind of came up empty, so I was wondering if anyone else had ideas.
I mean, I wish I had more specific examples for you, but I know that I'm like 95% sure that there have been at least a discussion of like the shipping and like ports, like, you know, workers who, you know, work on the like international shipping and like the import export industry in this country that like either have strikes or like at least discussing as such. Again, I wish I had specifics, but I mean, I think that yeah, like America's participation and like America's control of the global economy, like there's a huge industry there that I think that can be hard for the general demographic of like young downwardly mobile millennials that's, you know, like that's or like socialists in this country to kind of like remember those like port workers and stuff exist. I mean, a lot of them are immigrants. A lot of them, like, you know, we don't really encounter them in like on our day-to-day and like the urban centers that we like primarily exist in. But I mean, and that's just one. I'm sure there's more. Like I said, I don't have a lot of specifics, but I mean, like, you know, strikes there would just like obliterate this country. Yeah.
The supply chain.
Yes.
Very
There. Yeah.
critical.
Yes. I can do. Yeah.
Every time I go by a port, I'm like, oh, this is.
Yeah, also to add to it, rail workers as well
Yes.
are still striking.
For sure. Few more, leave?
Yeah, so, you know, I always think that the delivery industry writ large is the most open. You have the post office, the postal workers, you have UPS, you have the Amazon workers, and you have the, what's it called,
FedEx.
and FedEx. And, you know, they're, two of them are organized and two of them are not. One is brand new, and there's fluidity between the four. And if they could organize and build an alliance, they could be in a very strong position. I would suggest we make that a concentration.
Yeah, good idea. You in the back, I can't really see.
Yeah, so I was just gonna actually bring this back to the, this whole, like, what power do we have to the second point here, with the role of war and upholding capitalism, and how having outsourced so much of production to the global south, to the imperial periphery, actually is kind of a great hedge by the capitalists, so kind of take that card out of our hands. And why you see so much war, so much control over other nations, if they ever try to nationalize resources, start to hear a lot about human rights concerns in that part of the world and that sort of thing. I think that's definitely related as a capitalist strategy.
Sure. All right, couple more, and then we'll close it out. You in the back.
One behind the backpack or the?
Yeah.
Well, what I take from this is that the, you know, electoral and direct action are not in opposition, that you need both. That's what, you know, Deb started with direct labor action, and then both went on to form the IWW and the Socialist Party. And he loved the socialist towns in Wisconsin and elsewhere because they didn't sick the cops on the workers. And also that, you know, the good reforms that were passed before this Red Scare and stuff made it possible to, you know, they were empowering, but then they got rolled back. So sometimes you've got to fight those rollbacks, and it has to be non-legislative or non-electoral. And if you look at what's happened in Chile a couple of years ago, or in Israel now, where people, just the number of people in the streets, you know, that's also important. And that I get very frustrated when I listen to people talk as if it's an either or, when I don't know anybody that practices it as either or. And when the, you know, history and the news tells us it can't be.
Fair enough.
But they're always going to use this damn war shit and nativism to try to distract you.
That is definitely true. Yeah, I just had a thought about propaganda fatigue, actually. It is, you know, obviously a very anarchist concept, considering it doesn't necessarily involve like mass organizing to do it. It seems like it could be somewhat individualistic, the way that it's carried out. And I know that probably makes some socialists uncomfortable. But I think in modern times, we're seeing this type of thing carried out on sort of a mass scale with direct action tactics. Like, I'm not talking about terrorism, but like the tactics used, although, you know, the state can define anything as terrorism, as evidenced by, you know, the cops recently charging people with terrorism for being at a music festival in Atlanta, Festival of Music and Protest. But the way that these tactics often spread nowadays does seem to kind of echo that in a strange way, right? And it gets a little, like, I'm thinking about jumping the turnstiles, you know, in Chile. That happened in New York also, right after that. Or, but it can get a little screwy sometimes, right? Because the people who are picking up these sort of mimetic tactics, these mimetic ideas, don't necessarily even have to have politics that are unified with the people they're getting them from, right? Like, whatever you think of the uprising in Hong Kong, people have picked up some of these like frontline tactics and used them in other movements all over the world. So I don't have like a strong stance on it, but I do think it is something that is interesting that is happening right now that we need to keep an eye on.
Very nice. Yeah, I think we started off talking about the mill girls, and there was that quote where, you know, the girls were wondering if they would be striking that day or not, and quoted. And she just said, well, I am, and she walked out and everyone followed her. So, I mean, I think that brings it sort of full circle, and we can lead by example.
Yeah, for sure. I think, oh wait, one more.
Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to synthesize a few of these points, and I think the propaganda would be discussion is a good place to start. Which is my understanding is that a crucial feature of that idea among the anarchists was that they needed a way to spread their ideas. And there are a lot of literate people. There was not a, you know, a developed socialist means of communication. The newspapers were owned by the capitalist class. There wasn't television, there wasn't the internet, right? And part of the idea is, you know, if you kill a rich guy, people are going to learn about that pretty quick, even if the newspapers don't want us to put it in a positive light. Unfortunately, it turned out that, you know, the capitalist operation of that machine was quite effective at when you shoot a rich guy and he survives, you can get everyone to think that's a bad thing pretty effectively, even if they learn about it. So, you know, I think that that's sort of a limiting feature, but your description of, you know, the neo-propaganda, whatever you're describing that, where it's no longer, you know, let's do one explosive action and that'll get people to learn about it, even if they can't read a book, they might learn about something like that. It seems to describe sort of less so necessarily, you know, basing it off of an anarchist tactic 100 years ago. And once again, also repeatedly arising from the same condition. You know the limitations of the way you communicate these ideas. You have to develop some way to get around that, communicate to it. And then also there's a mention earlier of, you know, whether communism is socialism into the United States. And that was also brought up at the outset of this meeting. And I think to a certain degree that's, you know, worth getting people to understand that yes, there's a strong radical tradition in the United States, but on the left, another level, I'm concerned about an overemphasis on, like, you know, the United States, this country has its own socialist tradition that we need to uphold, which I think can be a little limiting, especially if we look at, for example, the way that propaganda the deed was responded to. Get them out of here, deport them. They're foreign now, they were once foreign, they're going to be foreign again, we don't have to worry about it. And I think, you know, with new emphasis on, you know, recognizing China as a core enemy of the United States, and discussing the idea of, you know, wars used the capitalist class, pressuring on Taiwan as, you know, a pinch point in that area. That type of thing I think could come back quite easily. But I think once again, there's new ways to sort of get around it. I don't want to overemphasize the extent to which, you know, the global movement was disconnected in that time in the 1920s. But I think there's a possibility to make it much less so now, to develop much greater international connections, so that, you know, even if there is a new emphasis on communism and socialism being, you know, non-endemic to the United States, there's a way to make it so that it won't be so easily separated, if that becomes, you know, once more a point that's pushed out. So.
Yeah, for sure. Marx said workers of the world unite, not workers of the United States, right? Or, let's see what's like Germany, yeah. All right, one more from Lee.
Yeah, so I think the propaganda of the deed is a good idea, but what is that deed? You know, the deed, in this case, it was a very individualist action. I think the things that you were saying, Jamie, about the propaganda of the deed, you have to look at Black Lives Matter and the those activities, it was the activity that people saw and they said, this is something I can do, and they did it. And that happened in the, what do you call it, in the Midi Spring type of things, et cetera, et cetera. And there's good things about that, but one of the problems is that the reason it happens is because there is no organization behind it. And people can unite with it because there's no organization that they agree with, so that they are willing to do that. So I think it's important for us to understand that the organization, that the propaganda of the deed is good, and it's activity, and people are willing to do it. And when it's appropriate, we should do it. But it's the mass activity of the deed, not the individualistic activity of the deed. Whether that deed is violent or not violent, it's the individualism that we really are against. If the masses of people are doing things that have violent aspects to it, that's okay with us, because the masses of people are doing it. If it's individualists, whether it's violent or whether it's or not, that's not for us. But over a period of time, we have to develop organizations that people can relate to the point where those activities can be led by organizations, because that's the only way you can go one step and then a second step and then a third step and then make fundamental change. So, you know, to me, that's the key.
Yeah.
Do the organization of the deed, but build mass organization that people support. And that's the bigger challenge in the US.
For sure, and that balance, that synthesis, right, between spontaneous activity of the class and an organization where people have somewhere to go to carry them through from one struggle to the next, but without becoming bureaucratic and in bed with the Democratic Party. I think that's the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges of our time as Black businesses, socialism. So yeah, I guess our time is up. It's almost 9.
We have announcements. I think Jeremy will be giving announcements.
Okay, great. Thank you for coming.
Can we just do one more slide? Just one last slide.
Can you do
Just one more slide. Well, no, because there's a slide. Keep the lid up a second. Yeah, the slide. Great. So first of all, let's give another round of applause and thank you to the production. I'm one of the co-chairs of NYCDSA and proud political educator. A few announcements, because we like to tie our theory to our practice always. First of all, political education. I mean, we're sitting in our amazing NYCDSA office. We do pay rent on that office, and political education to do ambitious, exciting events. We try to do all our events free, but that oftentimes they do cost money, and so if you do have a little bit to put in to build our pot so we can do cool political education things, we really appreciate it. Our treasurer, Carrington Morris, her Venmo is there for taking donations. We're also passing a bike helmet, passing a hat in the true New York form of a bike helmet, but we really appreciate it. It helps us build our ability to do more ambitious and dramatic events. In terms of some actions coming up, just highlighted a little bit on there, there's a big rally in Queens to tax the rich and to protect civil rights, to push against our governor's horrible attempt to put more people in jail. That's happening in Queens tomorrow. There's going to be a number of socialist electeds there, including AOC. So come out. It's going to be big and it's going to be strong, and we're going to be building the tenants movement and fighting back against bail rollbacks. You can find out about that and other actions, including a call with our legislators this week for an update on the budget on Thursday, and more at calendar.socialist.nyc. I also put on there one of our 2 priority campaigns, very related to this evening's lecture material, the Union Power campaign. You can check out the website there. That's a multi-pronged attempt to build a strong labor movement in New York, including new organizing, like at Trader Joe's just down the street, which just organized, which is freaking incredible. And deeply supported by DSA, and fighting for legislative reforms that would make it easier for workers to organize, like the Secure Jobs Act and other things. Political education, we have more of it coming. In 2 weeks, we have another session of this night school, Socialists of America. We'll be talking about the Popular Front and the New Deal period, so the 30s, obviously a very important period in American radical history. We also have some one-off special events coming up. This Saturday, Doug Henwood, one of our political educators, and a couple of other amazing presenters are going to be speaking on the recent bank failures, and here from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Why the hell did they happen? What the hell does it mean? I don't really know, so I'm excited to hear some Marxist economists talk about this. Very cool that we get to do that. So that's this weekend in the office. You can find it on the calendar to RSVP. And then on the 23rd, Sunday, April 23rd, we're going to have 2 MPs, members of parliament from La France Insoumise, the French left-wing party, are in town, and they're going to be presenting on the huge protests that have been burning shit down in France and fighting back against Macron. So that's a really cool opportunity. One of them is a major strike leader. So get to hear from comrades from another country. It's going to be really awesome. So please come out. Finally, the last thing I'll say is if you are not a member of DSA, Jamie ended with the question of organization, always a thorny one, but it's important for each of us to come together and build things that are bigger than ourselves to make the movement stronger. So please, 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 if you're not a member of DSA, become a member. Dues are relatively cheap. And it's important for us to build this all together. So thanks so much for that. And if you're a member, tell someone else to join. Because that's how we build a movement. Thank you so much. Thanks again, presenter. You can tell us what to do with our chairs.
Yeah, just everybody.